He didn't know I was already recording before he walked through the door. My half-brother always knocked like he owned the place. 3 hard slaps against the wood, the kind that rattled the frame. I heard it from my home office and didn't move. I just looked at the corner of my screen where the status icon glowed green. Connected. Uploading. Always uploading. I let him knock again. To my family, I was the one who never figured it out. My mother introduced me at dinner parties as her daughter who does something with computers. My stepfather, who had made his money flipping commercial real estate and believed that any work you couldn't photograph for a website wasn't real work, once told a friend of his that I was in between things. I was 31 years old. I had a master's degree in forensic accounting from Georgetown. I had a federal contractor badge that I kept in a locked drawer in my desk. But none of that mattered in that house, because my half-brother Daniel had started a landscaping company at 24, turned it into a regional franchise, and let my mother put his photo on her refrigerator. Daniel was 36. He was loud and tan and certain about everything. He had my stepfather's jaw and my stepfather's competence and my stepfather's complete inability to believe that consequences applied to him personally. I opened the front door. "You didn't answer my texts," he said, already walking past me. I was working. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He moved through the living room of the house I'd grown up in. I was renting the guest cottage out back. But the main house was still technically home to my mother and stepfather, who had been in Scottsdale for 3 weeks. And he picked up a framed photo from the console table, looked at it, and set it down in the wrong place. "Mom wants me to go through the files in Dad's study," he said. I felt my shoulders tighten. My stepfather. I had called him Dad since I was 9 years old, but lately the word felt like wearing someone else's shoes. Was in the middle of a federal investigation I was not allowed to discuss. What I can tell you is that 3 months earlier, a supervisor at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had asked me if I was comfortable taking an active contract role on a case involving people I knew personally. I had said yes. I had moved back into the cottage, told my mother it was to save money while I looked for a permanent apartment, and started working 18-hour days at a desk 12 feet from her garden. "The files are locked," I said. "I know they're locked. That's why I need you. You're good with computers, right?" He turned and gave me the smile he'd been giving me since we were kids, the one that said, "You are useful to me right now." "I'm not going to help you get into his files, Daniel." The smile dropped. That was the thing about my half-brother. He had no patience for the period between asking and receiving. He had grown up with a father who smoothed everything, who called people and made problems stop, who had never once in Daniel's life allowed him to sit in discomfort long enough to learn anything from it. "He's my father," Daniel said. "He's my stepfather. And those files are his private business. His private business is why Mom has been crying for 3 weeks." He took a step toward me and I held my ground. "You think I don't know what you're doing? You think I don't know what you're doing? You think I don't know why you suddenly decided to move back here after 4 years? You're working against your own family." "I don't know what you're talking about," he stared at me. I'd always been bad at lying about big things, but I'd gotten very good at saying true sentences in a tone that sounded like denial. I didn't know what he was talking about. I knew exactly what he was talking about, and those were 2 different statements. "You were always jealous," he said, "of me, of what Dad built. You sat in your little apartment doing your little government work, and you watched us succeed and you couldn't stand it." I didn't answer. There was nothing to answer. He had been telling this story about me for 15 years, and he believed it completely. "Where's your laptop?" he said. "My office. I need you to show me." "No." The word came out flat, not angry, just final, and I watched his face do the thing it always did when someone told him no, a kind of slow reddening, like a stove burner warming up. "Maya." His voice had dropped. "I'm not asking." "Then we have a problem." He grabbed my arm. I turned toward him and he shoved me against the doorframe, one hand on my shoulder, and the impact knocked the air out of me for a second. I pushed back. He was bigger than me, always had been, and he used that now, both hands on my shoulders, walking me backward down the hall. "Get your hands off me," I said. "Tell me where the files are." "There are no files, Daniel. You're lying." He slammed me into the wall and my head hit the plaster and I saw white at the edges of my vision. "You've been sitting here for 3 months, beating them everything. You think I haven't talked to people? You think I don't know how this works?" I tried to get my feet under me. He was close to my face now, and I could see that he had already made a decision. That he had walked into this house having already decided what he was going to do if I said no. This wasn't impulsive. He had planned this. He put his forearm across my throat. I had been trained as part of my contractor orientation in a basic self-defense course. I remembered almost none of it in that moment. What I remembered was the green light in the corner of my screen. Connected. Uploading. He pressed harder. I clawed at his arm and he leaned his weight into it, and I felt the pressure build behind my eyes. That strange darkening at the edges of your vision that your body uses to tell you it is running out of time. I heard him say something, "You should have stayed out of it." And then the hallway light got very far away and I felt my knees give. I woke up on the floor. The house was quiet. My throat felt like it had been squeezed through a fist, which it had. I lay there for a moment and looked at the ceiling and took inventory of what I could feel, which was everything, and all of it hurt. I rolled onto my side. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, loud and too fast. He was gone. I got up slowly, one hand on the wall. My vision swam and then steadied. I walked to my office. The laptop was still on my desk, untouched. He hadn't known which room it was in, or maybe he decided it wasn't worth the risk, or maybe he thought he'd scared me badly enough that I would do the work for him. The green status light was still on. It had been on the entire time. I sat down at my desk and I opened my case management portal and I looked at the upload log. Everything had been captured. The shouting in the living room. The impact against the wall. His forearm across my throat. His voice saying you should have stayed out of it. 41 minutes and 17 seconds of audio, automatically encrypted and uploaded to a federal server the moment it began. Because that was how the software worked. It was always on, always listening, always sending. Because the kind of work I did required a record, and the federal government did not trust contractors to remember to press record when things got dangerous. I picked up my phone and called my supervisor. She answered on the second ring. "I need to report a physical assault," I said, "and I think you're going to want to hear what he said before he did it." There was a pause. Then, "Are you hurt?" My throat. I blacked out briefly. "I'm okay now." Another pause. I could hear her thinking, "Don't touch anything. Don't touch anything. Don't call anyone. I'm sending someone." I sat back in my chair. I looked at the window, at the garden my mother had planted, at the roses she watered every morning when she was home. I thought about how she was going to take this. I thought about how she had always taken Daniel's side, not out of malice, but out of a kind of willful narrowness. If she looked directly at who her son was, she would have to look directly at who her husband was. And that was a thing she had decided long ago not to do. I thought about my stepfather in Scottsdale, and I thought about the 17 shell companies and the 4 years of redirected estate funds, and the 3 business partners who had already agreed to cooperate with the investigation. And I thought about how none of that would have come together without someone living in the guest cottage, working 18-hour days, rebuilding a paper trail that had been very carefully dismantled. I made myself a cup of tea. I sat at the kitchen table and drank it and waited. 2 agents arrived 40 minutes later. One of them had been on my case team. She was calm and thorough, and she photographed my throat, which had already begun to bruise, and she sat across from me at the kitchen table and went through everything in order. I told her exactly what happened. I told her what Daniel had said about feeding information to the government. I told her he had asked about the files in my stepfather's study. "That's going to be useful," she said. I thought it might be. She looked at me for a moment. "You're sure you want to proceed?" I had been asked this question before at the beginning of the contract. I had thought about it carefully then. I thought about it again now, with the bruise forming on my throat and the taste of the fear still somewhere in the back of my mouth. And I thought about the 3 business partners who had lost their retirement savings, and the 2 employees who had come forward and then been quietly pressured not to, and I thought about the long, careful work of the last 3 months, and I said yes. They arrested Daniel that evening at his office. He had driven there after leaving my house. He had made 3 phone calls on the way, one of them to my stepfather, and those calls were added to the record. He had done exactly what frightened, guilty people do. He had immediately tried to coordinate a story, and in doing so, had handed the investigation a clear, documented chain of communication between himself and the primary subject. My stepfather's lawyers called my mother within the hour. She called me 4 times. I let them go to voicemail. I sat in my cottage and I ate a sandwich and I read a novel, and I tried to remember the last time I had felt my shoulders in their natural position, not pulled up toward my ears, not braced for something. It took 2 more months for the full picture to come together. I can tell you the broad outline. My stepfather had been redirecting funds from a family real estate trust that had been set up to benefit both his biological children and me, as a stepdaughter, when my grandfather passed away and left a significant property portfolio. The redirection had been happening for years, through a series of transactions that looked legitimate until you put them side by side and measured them against what should have been there. My stepfather had known about the investigation for 6 weeks before Daniel came to my house. He had been the one to tell Daniel where I was working from. He had been the one to suggest that if the files on his study computer could be accessed and certain records altered, the timeline might become impossible to reconstruct. They had sent Daniel to do it because Daniel was useful, and because neither of them believed I would fight back. I had always been the quiet one, the one who didn't cause scenes, the one who was good at computers and easy to overlook. My stepfather was indicted on 4 counts. 2 of the charges related to the financial crimes the investigation had been building toward. A 3rd charge was obstruction of justice. The 4th was conspiracy. For the conversation he had with Daniel on the phone the afternoon Daniel came to my house, the conversation in which he told his son that she won't do anything, just scare her, she's not going to call anyone, she never does. Daniel was charged with felony assault, conspiracy, and witness tampering. His lawyer argued that he hadn't known I was a federal contractor, that he had thought it was a family dispute. The audio upload from my case management system was introduced as evidence. The jury heard his voice. They heard mine. They heard 37 seconds of silence that the forensic audio analysts identified as consistent with pressure applied to a victim's throat. They did not have difficulty deciding. What I want to tell you about the sentencing, because I know this is what you're waiting for, is that I did not go. I had testified. I had done my part. I did not need to sit in a courtroom and watch my stepfather try to look smaller than he was. And I did not need to watch my half-brother sit in a suit that his lawyers had picked out for him and try to perform remorse. I knew what he looked like when he was genuinely sorry, because I had seen it once, when he was 11 years old and he broke a neighbor's window with a baseball and our parents were out and there was no one to call and he had to sit with what he had done for 4 hours before anyone came home. That was the last time I ever saw him sorry. Every apology after that was performance. My mother came to find me 3 days after the verdict. She stood in the doorway of my cottage, and she looked at the bruise that had mostly faded by then, and she said, very quietly, that she didn't understand how I could do this to my family. I had thought about this conversation for months. I have rehearsed versions of it at 2 in the morning when I couldn't sleep. In most of those rehearsals, I said something measured and fair, something that acknowledged her pain while holding firm about what had happened, something that sounded like the person I wanted to be. What I actually said was, he put his arm across my throat until I blacked out, Mom. He was trying to cover up what your husband did to my grandfather's money. To my money. That was what this was. She pressed her lips together. I could see her working through it the way she always worked through things that required her to choose between 2 versions of reality. He's your brother, she said finally. He's your son. He's my half-brother, and he made his choices. She left without saying goodbye. I watched her walk back up the path to the main house, and I felt something settle in me, something that had been suspended for a long time. Not relief, exactly. More like the feeling of setting down something heavy that you had been carrying so long you had forgotten it wasn't attached to you. I stayed in the cottage for 2 more months, finishing my contract work. The case closed cleanly. My supervisor wrote a commendation that went into my file. I received a settlement from the estate trust that covered what had been redirected, plus interest, which was enough to put a down payment on a townhouse in Alexandria and still have something left over. I have a deadbolt now, and a Ring camera, and a dash cam in my car that runs continuously, because I am a forensic accountant who has thought carefully about the nature of evidence, and I understand that the moments you need a record are never the moments you expect. I have both my stepfather's attorneys and Daniel's attorneys on a blocked list on my phone. I have my mother's number still saved because I am not ready to delete it, though I have not answered when she calls. I want to tell you one more thing because I think it matters. The morning after Daniel was arrested, before the calls started and before the lawyers got involved, I sat at my desk in the quiet of the early morning and I opened my upload log one more time. I read through the transcript of the audio. I read the part where he said I was jealous. I read the part where he said I should have stayed out of it. I read the 37 seconds marked consistent with pressure applied to throat. And then I scroll past all of that to the top of the log, to the very first timestamp of the session, which read 9,004 a.m., and I looked at what the audio had captured before Daniel arrived. It was just me, at my desk, working. The soft sound of keys. The occasional click of a mouse. The particular quiet of a house where someone is doing something careful and methodical and slow. I had been there first. He had walked into my space, into my work, into a record that had already been running, and he had made every single choice that followed, and not one of those choices had been forced on him, and not one of them had been my responsibility. He thought I was the background of his story. He had never once considered that I might be the one keeping the record. That was his first mistake. It was also his last.